User account control. One thing people never get tired of bashing Microsoft for is security. Now, even though Windows has gotten more secure with every new release, people still aren't satisfied with the security features of Windows. In Vista, though, Microsoft have gone a long way towards addressing these concerns and have introduced new features to combat security threats both from external influences such as the internet and from within, for example an uneducated user that can accidentally muck things up. So before we get started and talk about user account control, I want to talk about a couple of things that Microsoft have done under the hood to make Vista an overall more secure product. Firstly, services now run using the least possible privileges. This means that in the event that a service is somehow exploited, the service won't be running as an administrator and the potential damage that it could cause to your system is minimized. Now, Microsoft have also changed the way that buffer overruns are handled. A buffer overrun is simply a situation where a process tries to store data in a location outside of the computer's memory buffer. Now, in the past, this could open up several problems, from the application simply crashing to the operating system crashing, or much worse, with an attacker gaining administrative control over your machine. Now, in Vista, a program that is suspected of trying to cause a buffer overrun will be automatically terminated, and that minimizes any potential damage. Another feature of Vista is data redirection. You see, when applications run under a standard user account and they attempt to write to a protected system folder, such as the Program Files directory or the Windows directory, behind the scenes, it gets temporarily redirected to a virtual file store within the user's profile. And applications that want to write to the Windows registry, like HKey Local Machine, will also be redirected to the user's personal section of the registry. This means that whilst providing backwards compatibility so that older programs can still run, it's more secure since these applications are no longer able to overwrite or modify these system critical areas, which makes Vista all the more stable and less likely to be brought to its knees by a malicious program. Now finally, on a 64-bit edition of Vista, and let's face it, over time we'll all be moving to 64-bit anyway, Microsoft have implemented a feature called PatchGuard, which forces you to only use digitally signed drivers, which ensures that the code is what it claims to be and it hasn't been altered in any way. Okay, so we'll go and click on Start, and we'll launch the control panel, and then we'll choose Security. Alright, now notice these little icons, these shield icons all over the place here in the control panel. These icons represent tasks that require elevated or administrator privileges to be able to perform. Now when you click on any button or link that has one of these shields next to it, you'll be invoking user account control that requires you to either have administrative privileges or have an administrator handy so that they can enter their password to be able to run it. So say, for example, if we click on Check Firewall Status here, this brings up this dialog box that asks us if we want to continue or not. Now this is user account control in action, and whilst it might seem annoying to have to click on Continue all of the time, it's a safeguard mechanism that prevents applications from simply going ahead and installing their code without your consent. And that's a good thing, since that's one way that so many malicious bits of spyware get on your system in the first place. You visit a website, all of a sudden you've got ActiveX controls installed that you never wanted or needed, and you might suddenly find that your web browser's homepage been hijacked. And not only is it a real pain, it's also dangerous, since these sorts of applications spam you with advertising, they might log your passwords, and they can be difficult to not only find, but to remove. Now with user account control, you'll get this pop-up message like this here, asking you if you do want to continue with any sort of system modification, and that can alert you to the fact that something is going on that you neither asked for or want, and you can safely reject the change by clicking Cancel. Now part of the reason that this level of protection is possible is due to the fact that most tasks on Windows Vista now run as a standard user account, and any activity that can cause damage is governed by user account control. And this goes for the administrators as well, by the way. The truth is, even when you are logged on with an administrator account, which I am now, we still perform tasks using a standard user account's credentials. Only when we choose to do something that really requires administrator credentials does our account actually run as an administrator and user account control kicks in. Now there is one exception to this rule, the actual built-in administrator account. When you first install Vista, it required you to create a user account, and that account became an administrator, which is governed by these rules I just mentioned. But the built-in default administrator account, the one called administrator, isn't governed by user account control, and it still uses the older XP style privileges. Now I know that most of you are probably like me, so used to using computers that you tend to blindly just click on OK on any dialog box, but with user account control you should stop and read the message. Now in general though, if you've clicked something and deliberately attempted to install software or change some settings like I just did here, then blindly clicking on continue is unlikely to cause you any drama, but if a user account control message just pops up out of the blue, then you should seriously stop and take notice of it, because something has just requested higher access to your machine and it might not have been you. Alright, well I'm just going to cancel this now, and let's take a look at how we can turn user account control off. Now it's obviously not my recommendation to do so, but since I like to show you everything, and ultimately you are responsible for your own computer, let's see how we can do it. Okay, so we'll click the back button in our control panel here, and we'll go over here on the top right to User Accounts and Family Safety, and then we'll choose the User Accounts link, and at the bottom here we'll choose to turn User Account Control on or off. Now we will need to click Continue on our User Account Control message, and now we can simply uncheck this box, and once you click on OK you will need to restart your computer, and then User Account Control will be turned off. Now I'm going to cancel this though, as we'll move on, as there's another thing I want to mention about user account control. Now if I just hit F1 on my keyboard, and this will bring up the inbuilt Windows help, so in our search field here I'm just going to type in UAC for user account control and hit enter. And if we select the top link here, and if we scroll down through this help file, you'll notice that we have 4 different types of security icons and a description of each. Now the first icon at the top here is the one that we saw a lot of when we opened up our control panel, indicating that we will be invoking user account control as Windows requires our permission to perform an operation. Now the next icon we see here with the orange shield on a grey background, this one is displayed whenever a program needs your permission to continue and the program does have a valid digital signature. Now the orange on orange shield is the same as the other one, except this one here doesn't have a valid digital signature, meaning there is a possibility that the application isn't what it claims to be. And finally we have this red shield here, which means that a program has been blocked by an administrator. So when you see these icons here around the traps when you're clicking around in Windows Vista, you'll now know what they mean. Now if you happen to be running the Business or Ultimate editions of Windows Vista, you can use the local security policy to change the behaviour of user account control. So if we click on Start, and I'll just type in local, and we'll launch our local security policy, and we'll click Continue. We'll come over to the left, we'll expand local policies, and we'll select security options. Now on the right hand side we'll scroll all the way down to the bottom, and down here we can see a bunch of policies relating to user account control. In fact, I think there's about 8 or 9 of these, and as you can see, quite a lot of these are already enabled. In fact, the very first user account control policy, which is disabled, is the one that prevents the built-in administrator account from being affected by user account control. So if you do want to happen to change that, you can enable this policy. Okay, well, the next policy we've got here defines what you want to do with the user account control message. The default is, as we've seen in this video, it pops up with a continue and a cancel button. But you can change this if you like. We'll right-click, select Properties, and we can change this to Elevate without prompting if you like, and that'll automatically just let Vista do what it was asking to do without asking you about it. We could prompt for our credentials, which is one step further, which would force us to have to enter in our password, or we can leave the default here and it just pops up a continue or cancel message like we've seen. Okay, well, the next policy we've got here is basically the same policy for standard users. The next policy we have here detects application installations and prompts for elevated credentials, and that's enabled by default, and I wouldn't change that. Next is to only elevate executables that are digitally signed and validated. Now, this is disabled by default, so unsigned code can still run, and it's probably wise to leave it disabled since it's highly likely that old applications will have problems if you enable this. Okay, well, the final four policies we can see here are enabled by default, and I wouldn't change them personally. The first here only allows applications that are stored in a secure location, meaning the program files and Windows directories to be executed with the highest privileges. The next policy runs the administrator as a standard account and only requests elevation when running a task that requires it. Now, if you turn this feature off, and you'll have to reboot Vista if you do, then you've just mitigated one of Vista's most secure features, and you're now running as an administrator all the time. So as such, I really don't recommend that you disable this policy. Now, the second last policy here determines whether user account control will switch you to the secure desktop when requiring elevated privileges. And the default behavior is to use the secure desktop, which can only receive messages from Windows processors, which prevents malicious programs from doing their dirty work. So again, I wouldn't recommend that you set this to disabled. And finally, we'll use the virtualization we spoke about at the beginning of this video to redirect old application write failures to special locations in the file system and the registry. Now, the only reason that you'd want to turn this feature off is if you happen to be running only Vista certified applications, which is probably unlikely since Vista is still pretty new. So leave it enabled, or you just might find that your other applications will fail to install. Now, since we're here in the local security policy, there is one other policy that's worth pointing out, although it's not actually a user account control policy. If we click on the audit policy folder and then choose audit privilege use, here we can log in the Windows event log all attempts of a standard user or administrator to elevate a process to a full administrator process. And that can be useful for finding out who's made changes to the system. So if we right click and select Properties, the two settings here are successes and failures, and as obvious as it sounds, success logs successful attempts to elevate privileges, and failures logs failed attempts to elevate privileges. Now, obviously, the average home user is unlikely to be playing around with auditing, but in a highly secure corporate environment, it's a very real option. Okay, in this video, we've talked about user account control, what it is, and why it's a good thing. Sure, many people I've spoken to find the prompts annoying, and that's understandable, but it's certainly better than the alternative of having a less secure system. And personally, I think it's good to see Microsoft taking the initiative and making Windows more secure. Of course, you can turn it off if you like, although for obvious reasons I don't recommend that you do. After all, a couple of prompts really isn't a bad thing, and it hardly gets in the way of your productivity. So isn't it worth it to have a much more secure system? I think so.